Hello, BariAftercare friends, and welcome to a brand new episode of BariAftercare, the podcast. I'm excited about this episode, and I'm excited because there's a little bit of a lesson in here for all of us. Hopefully, there's a little bit of a lesson in each of these episodes, but this is one that you might think, does this really pertain to my bariatric aftercare? Well, actually, it absolutely does. And the topic for tonight is perception versus perspective and your life as a post-op. And I think that if you listen to this with open ears and an open mind, you might find some ways to change your trajectory. Not just in maybe how you eat or how you follow through with, healthier behaviors, but in terms of your relationships with friends, with coworkers, with strangers. And it's all about perception and perspective, excuse me. So we're going to talk about what the difference is between perception and perspective, and how these two things are really very interrelated, and how they can make a huge difference with a little bit of tweaking, because we all come to the table. The table might mean the dinner table. It might mean a table at a restaurant. It might mean a table in a boardroom. It might be a figurative table and you're in a car with friends. But we all come into the world as adults with a perspective that has been forming over years and years and years. I was just at a lot of the national parks last week, and talk about things being created over years and years and years. And I couldn't help but think, because I was thinking about this podcast episode while I was there, that the things that happen in nature, water, earthquakes, ice age, all of those things had a huge impact on what the earth looks like today. And the things that have happened over the course of our lifetime, maybe we haven't been in a flood or an earthquake, but we've had experiences, we've had people in our lives, we've had a certain level of education, we've had good education or not so great education, we've come from different socioeconomic status families, we've come from different cultures. All of those things combine to form the perspective with which we face the world today. So our perspective is our worldview. It's kind of our attitude. And I decided to talk about this topic because I recently had a patient, and I'm going to disguise everything so you'll not have any idea who this patient is, but this patient heard a person on some social media talking about this perception versus perspective. And she was talking about her situation. And her situation was that her father hadn't been very active in her life as she was growing up. He would be in her life and then he would be out of her life. But for the most part, what he did was, after her parents divorced when she was very, very young, and she lived with her mom, her dad would make these promises. And this is not a, very unique story. This happens to a lot of people. Parents separate or divorce, and one or the other parents makes a lot of promises. I'll be there to pick you up for the weekend, or, I'm going to pick you up at such and such a time, and we're going to go to the ball game, or whatever it was. Well, her father had a drug problem. And even though this can happen with people who have no drug problem or have a drug problem or an alcohol problem or whatever, he was very inconsistent. And so as she was growing up, she formed a perspective, a world view. And our world views oftentimes, and this is where we're going to get into this in a little bit, our world views that form as we grow up often transfer into our lives as adults, whether we're aware of it or not. And sometimes we even create situations that will kind of um, give more oomph to our perspective. It's like the self-fulfilling prophecy, like, see, I told you. And in her case, it was men aren't trustworthy. Men aren't trustworthy. Men aren't trustworthy. So not surprisingly, she had had a series of relationships as a young woman in which, lo and behold, she chose men that, surprise, surprise, were not trustworthy. They would cheat on her, or they would ghost her, and so it reinforced to her perspective. Men aren't trustworthy. So what happened was, and what we were working on in her therapy, was that she's now grown. She's in a pretty good relationship. Things are going pretty well. They're working through their issues. She's working on trusting her husband, who is very trustworthy, by the way. But she has this idea in her head, so she's kind of always looking for reasons not to trust him. And so that's one of the things we're working on. And what happened was that her father wrote her a letter recently. And in the letter, which she read to me, and we read several times, he was saying that he was very, very genuinely sorry. He was apologizing for the kind of father that he had turned into. He apologized for breaking his promises to her many, many times. He apologized for being neglectful. And he told her that he had never wanted to be the kind of father to his child or his children that his own father had been to him. And he went on to talk about what it was like for him as a child. And he acknowledged that he had turned to drugs because he carried so much pain and so much anger. And he apologized for all of it. So we talked about the father's letter in terms of both the patient's perception, which is different than perspective, and her perspective, and what we imagined the father's perspective to be. So let me break down these terms, and then we'll review this situation and go on to talk about how this can play out in your own bariatric life. So perspective and perception. It took me for a while to think about these things too. So we talked about perspective, which is your framework. It's your overall framework. You kind of have a mindset, and that mindset is your worldview, and it's your point of view. And it is determined and created by the life you have led. It's been influenced throughout the course of your life. It's been influenced by your belief system, maybe by if you went to church and if you had religious beliefs, or maybe you didn't. It's determined by your level of education. So maybe, as people get higher and higher levels of education, they're exposed to more ways of thinking. Our perspective is formed by what kind of perspectives our parents had, and our grandparents, and our aunts and our uncles. And we're influenced by the group mindset that we are born into and live through. So family history is a big issue in helping to determine and frame our point of view. Our age, the older we are, we have an older person mindset. The younger you are, the generations have different points of view on things. Your health experiences can impact how you feel about healthcare systems or politics, so all of these things play into, and like I said, our culture, our nationality, our ethnicities, all of these things play into our perspective or our way of looking at the world. And I'll give you a couple examples that'll help illustrate this. One is the classic, you see a cup and there's half a glass of water. Now, depending on your perspective, what's happened in your life, if you've If you've tend to had a lot of bad luck, or you've had difficult circumstances in your life, or your parents and your family members were kind of negative Nellies, you're like, that's a half empty cup. That's your perspective. You kind of tend to view the world from a half empty cup perspective. You look for, excuse me, you see the worst in things because that's kind of how you've seen the world. Versus people who maybe have had, things have kind of gone their way. It's kind of like they were born with a silver spoon in their mouth and everything's coming up roses around them. And they go, wow, that is a half full cup. Two different perspectives formed from different experiences, different worldviews, different ways of life, different things you've experienced. Now I'm going to give you another one, and you will all get this. And I'm just going to say, think politics. Think politics. Think the last election cycle and the vitriol that was on all of the social media, because people have very different perspectives because of their world view. So you have one party that's dyed in the wool this way, and it's based on their experiences, what they heard from their parents, what kind of television they watch, what kind of people they hang around with. And then you have people on the other side of the aisle who are equally as dyed in the wool, and they are equally adamant that their perspective is right and the other perspective is wrong. And this comes from their growing up, from their education, from their nationality, from their culture. All of these things form our perspective. So I think you get the idea of what a perspective is. So the woman, my client, her perspective based on her experiences, not to mention that her mother spoke very badly about men in general. This woman that I'm working with had a really negative opinion about men. Her perspective was that they are not trustworthy based on her experiences. Okay, so what then is a perception? So a perception is the way we interpret something. So we see something and we interpret it from the point of view of our perspective. So let's say that, again, this cup that's half full or half empty of water. If your perspective on life is that, you know what, life is good, you work through things, they're going to work out eventually, don't sweat the small stuff. Your perception, the way you interpret, the way you look at this glass, your sensory information, you see a cup that's half full. So your perception is your sensory information. What are you observing? What are you taking in? It's immediate. It's based on a situation. But it's going to come from your worldview, your perspective. Let's say that, you witness an accident and you work for an insurance company. So your perspective is that, oh my gosh, it's always the driver's fault because we don't want to pay anything. So what you've witnessed may be very different from somebody who's been in 3 accidents and, they're like, these darn insurance companies don't pay anything. So their perception is that the driver was not at fault. So what we see, what we witness is an interpretation of where we come from in the world. So back to my client. Comes into her adult life with the perception that men kind of suck, which was reinforced by her mom, kind of taught to her by her mom, but her dad played a huge role in that because he was inconsistent. He was not there for her. So she gets this letter from her dad, and she doesn't have a very good perspective of him. Now, from my point of view as a therapist who's supposed to be pretty neutral about these things, what I heard when she read this letter was a very sincere, genuine apology. I could have been wrong, doesn't matter. But this is what I heard coming from him. And when you do a job for 30 years, you know, you kind of know your job and you get a good feel and a good sense of thing. Again, I could be wrong, but my perception was this was a heartfelt letter. Her perception was that, yeah, it's just another attempt to get into my life. She could have been right. You know, I don't know the circumstances well enough. But we talked about her perspective was that she was going to be inclined to disregard anything from her father because of her past history. This is where it's going to come into play and be relevant to your bariatric experience in just a few minutes, okay? So she's coming at this from, I don't want to hear from my dad. Why would I trust this? He's never been trustworthy before in my life, which I get. I totally get it. And we also talked about how this letter doesn't really change the past, and she has every right to be angry, to be hurt, to distrust him. Absolutely. And then we looked at it from, I asked her, could she put herself in her father's shoes and look at the writing of this letter from his perspective? This is an amazing skill. If every one of us were able to do this, the world would be a much, much healthier place. Not only on a large scale, think politics. If I could say, you know what, my beliefs are A, B, and C, and that's where they stay, not a problem. But given where you've come from and from what you've experienced, I can understand that your perspective is X, Y, and Z. So while I still am going to be pretty true to my ABC, I have a little bit of change of heart or thinking, and I respect where you're coming from. Oh my gosh, think about the difference that would make in life. And I will tell you on a personal level, not politically, but in my marriage, forever, my husband and I were stuck on, this is how I see the argument. My side is ABC. He'd say, well, this is how I see the argument. My side is X, Y, and Z. And we were both stuck in our perspectives, right? And our perception of what happened. So our perception is, this is the current argument. This is what I saw. This is what I heard you say. But the overall point of view of my life, my perspective, is where my perception is coming from. Same for him. So when I was willing to, when he became willing to, and we had to learn this in therapy, I will tell you that. When I was willing to say, you know what, Steve, when I said this to him, he heard this. And he heard something different than my intention was because of his background. And when I was willing to look at his background and say, oh my gosh, no wonder when I said this, he heard it as an accusation or whatever. My intention wasn't to be an accusation. It was to say, this is what I see happening, an observation, and this is how it's affecting me. But until we were able to learn to look at the situation from each other's perspective, we would get caught in the same cycle of arguing forever and ever and ever. It was like we had these dance steps, and we knew the dance steps, and we could pretty much play out an argument without the other person being involved because we practiced the unhealthy way of doing it for so many years until we learned the healthy skill of going, all right, you know what, Connie, from where you're coming from, your perception of this argument based on your perspective of life, of course it means this to you. For Steve, his perception is this is what he heard based on his lived experience of X, Y, and Z. So when we were able to do that and be more open to saying, okay, it makes sense to me why you would hear that. Let me help you understand better where I was coming from. And vice versa. He would say, okay, Connie, given where you grew up and how your family interacted and the type of communication in your family. I understand how it came across that way. That's not going to work for me. If you want me to hear you better, let's try this. And we had to work together with our therapist to work through these things until we were able and willing to do it on our own. So looking at something from another person's perspective, it may not change how you feel necessarily in the moment, but it can help you have maybe a little compassion for where they're coming from. And hopefully they're willing to do the same for you. So when my client looked at the perspective from where her father came from, and she talked about some of the things she knew about his childhood and how he had been let down, and not only let down by his father, he had been physically abused by his father. He had been, all these other things. She said, it doesn't change the fact that he let me down, and I am hurt and angry about that. But when I look at where he came from, I'm able, from my adult perspective, to have some compassion for how he turned to drugs and how he didn't have the skills, or he didn't seek out the skills to be a better father than his was. So that change of perspective softened her heart a little bit. It didn't take away the pain she felt as a child, nor should it. But it helped her be compassionate for herself as a child and say, you have every right to feel that way. But as an adult, to lessen her anger toward her father because she was able to view him as a hurt human being also, which gave them something in common. So when we're able to change our perspective just a little bit, when we're able to be willing to say, okay, here's my perception based on my past. But if you look at it from, let's say we're looking into a room and 6 people are looking in from 6 different windows. So based on what window you're looking in from, you're going to have a different perception because you're going to have a different literal view of that room. So everybody's going to have a different perception. And for us, our perception is based on our perspective, our worldview. And a lot of times we hear the adage that perception is reality. Because this is how I view things, it makes things real. So when I hear my husband get defensive without taking his perspective into view, I'm like, you just always get defensive when I say anything. When I give you any feedback, you just get defensive. So my perception is my husband is a defensive man. That's my perception because that's what I hear emanating from him if I give him what I consider to be constructive feedback. So my perception is locked in stone in my mind because what I hear from you is defensiveness. Now, when I learned my husband's story, which is that, and this is true, there were 6 kids in that family, 5 boys. He was his mother's scapegoat, and all 6 of the children would tell you that his mother took almost everything out on him and blamed him for a messy house and blamed him for her bad mood and blamed him. So my husband is super sensitive to anything that feels like criticism. So if I'm giving, from my perspective, I'm saying this is constructive feedback. And what he hears is, you are accusing me of something I didn't do. All I'm seeing in my perception is his defensiveness. So I had to be willing to understand his worldview. He's very sensitive to what he hears as criticism. So now my perception is different. I'm like, okay, I see and hear what looks like defensiveness. With a greater insight, I can understand that this is my husband who's responding from his hurt and wounded child self, trying to defend himself from his mother's harsh criticism. Now, does that mean I just have to accept that I can't give him feedback or he's going to get defensive? No. But I also have to be sensitive to this as a real issue for him. Now, he needs to get into his big boy panties when we talk, and he needs to say, okay, and he's done a great job of this. I'm so impressed with saying to himself, this is not my mother talking to me. This is my wife coming to me with what appears to be a valid concern and responding to me from his healthy adult self. I also have had to learn to say, listen, I have something that I want to share with you, and I want you to know it's not an accusation. I'm sharing an observation of something with you so that I kind of give him a heads up. This is not something I'm trying to accuse you of or criticize you with. So we both had to learn and understand each other's perspective, which was enough to help us change our perception. So perception isn't really reality. It's what you believe to be reality, but it might not be reality. Because his reality, his perception was that I was criticizing and accusing him. My perception was, I'm trying to give you some valuable feedback. But it was only until we were able to put ourselves in each other's shoes and look at perspective that we were able to change. How does this apply to your bariatric life? Well, let's think about this, all right? So, all right, we talked about my client and how she was able to soften her perspective, her worldview from an adult perspective. Really a good thing that she was able to do. So, I just want to dissect that situation a little bit more, okay? To help you maybe understand more fully perspective and perception. So she'd lived the majority of her life without her dad. He wasn't an active part of it. The things that shaped her overall perspective about him and men in general was that her point of view in relation to him was that he was not to be trusted, that he was unreliable. He didn't really care about her because that's the message his behavior sent, and that's what a child does. They internalize that kind of behavior as, I don't matter, you're not reliable. You know, that was her reality. So maybe her her experiences and her belief had expanded, and they had done so because she started to believe that all men were unreliable. And interestingly, she would gravitate toward men who were unreliable so that it confirmed her bias, confirmation bias. So her perspective about her dad was like seeing the cup half empty. When she got the letter from him, she read it, and this perspective of I don't trust you, immediately her perception was I don't trust this letter. With good reason. With good reason. So we talked about it, and she was willing to read that letter again and again to try to hear his perspective in his words, to try to understand the experiences that had shaped his life. So as she did read that letter, she realized he's the product of where he came from. Now, he did have a choice, and we all have a choice at some point to say, if I don't want to be like my father, then there are some things I need to do. I need to take some parenting classes. I need to work through my own issues. And he didn't do that. And so she remained hurt and angry about that. Don't blame her. Some of us, like you and like me, we take this and we say, you know what? I don't want to be like, my family who, in my case, continued to drink and do drugs and live in the life of an addict and carry that on to their children and grandchildren. You made the choice that you didn't want to continue to live in a body that was unhealthy as a result of the disease of obesity. So we have made different choices. Now, our mindset doesn't change just because I quit drinking or just because you had bariatric surgery. So like my client, we have to be willing to go, okay, how has my perspective, mine personally, coming from the family of addiction, following the footsteps in addiction and finding a life of recovery, how has that formed my perspective? And how did my perspective change once I got into recovery? You've had weight loss surgery. You've lost a tremendous amount of weight. So your body has changed. What about your perspective? You still come from a life, not everybody, but a lot of people have come from a life of struggling with weight for many, many years, which means you've come from a perspective of maybe, and again, I'm not speaking for everybody. This is just general. So if it doesn't fit for you, don't get mad at me. I'm not talking about you then. If it does fit for you, then listen, because this could be something for you to consider. And I get this information because I've worked in this field for over 20 years, and I have a lot of people describe to me their experiences of having struggled with weight for many, many years. So this could be your experience. They were treated less kindly than people who didn't struggle with weight. That may have been your experiences as a child, as a teen, as an adult. We know that that happens. We know that a lot of segments of society will treat people poorly if they carry extra weight. It's not limited to just weight, but that is one segment of the population that is treated less valued, with less value. Maybe you were overlooked for job promotions. Now, this may or may not have specifically been about your weight, but we're going to come back to that with perspective in just a minute. So maybe you were made fun of as a kid. Maybe you were unfairly judged. Maybe this was based solely on your weight. Maybe you were overlooked for a job promotion. It may have been related to your weight. You may have been shunned by friend groups. Maybe you were the last person in PE class to be picked for, the Red Rover, send Sally right over. Maybe you were called names. Maybe you experienced a number of these things. And so your perspective over time has become, I'm going to be overlooked. I'm going to be left out. I'm going to be made fun of. Now, I'm not judging you. I came from the perspective of, oh, people just need to get over it. Let a person have a drink. What's wrong with happy hour? My drinking's not going to affect my kids. That was my perspective before I went into treatment. So maybe because you've been hurt, because, in different ways, you have a very protective outer layer. But the perspective is all people hate people who carry extra weight. All people judge people who are overweight negatively. If I don't get this job promotion, it's absolutely because of my weight. And so the perspective, my life view, my world view, based on what I've experienced, might be like, screw the people who don't struggle with weight. What do they know? They just, so we judge the people who aren't in our camp, just like the people who aren't in the camp of carrying extra weight judge those who carry extra weight. Worldview, experience. So the people who've never had to struggle with weight go, why don't they just push away from the table? Why don't they just quit eating the crap? Right? Not healthy, not a healthy perspective, but that's their perspective. They don't get it. Just like people who do struggle with weight don't get not having to struggle with it. So our perspective comes from a different place. So what happens, just like my client grew up expecting men to be untrustworthy, expecting men to make false promises, expecting men to not be reliable, because that's what she expected. What are your expectations as a result of having grown up with the things that have happened to you in relation to your weight? Do you expect to be left out? Do you expect to be judged by most people or all people? Do you expect to be overlooked? do you say anytime you're treated a way you don't feel is right, do you say it's because of your weight? Not from your perspective, but are you assuming the other person is treating you that way because of your weight? So maybe you apply for a job promotion and you're truly not qualified, but you don't get the job. Do you go home and talk to your family and say, it's just because of my weight? That could very well be your perspective. So what I'm going to ask you to do and hope that you will do, and this goes for all of us, whether it be politics or a weight bias or a non-weight bias or an addiction bias or an alcoholism bias or a bald person bias or a gender bias or a race bias, is to be aware that we have a perspective from which we view the world. And if we are not willing to look beyond our perspective, then our perception of every situation, how we experience it, is going to be tainted by whatever the issue we're coming from is. So if I am, a minority, a woman, right? Then if I'm overlooked for something, then I think it's because I'm a woman, automatically. Well, it may or may not be, right? So wherever you're coming from, everything that doesn't go my way isn't because I'm a woman. Everything that doesn't go your way or how you're treated isn't because of your weight. Everything that doesn't go somebody's way isn't because of their gender or their race or their religion. But if that's your perspective, you're going to turn everything into that, right? If you're looking for apples, everything's going to look like an apple. We look for what we believe. We see what we want to see. And unfortunately, we're attracted to oftentimes people who are going to treat us in the way that is painfully familiar to us. So, these lived experiences that we have all had in relation to whatever it is, and the thoughts that accompany them. So we're back to what we've experienced shapes our thoughts, forms our viewpoint, our life perspective. So if you've suffered from the disease of obesity, you are coming from that mindset. And it may be, you know what, my weight didn't bother me at all. It didn't keep me from having friends. Nobody treated me poorly. That could also be your perspective. But I don't know what your experiences were. You do. I don't know how you view the outside world, but you do. And if it's from a glass half empty perspective, for good reason maybe, just like my client, she had good reason not to trust her father. But is that where you want to stay? Do you want to assume that everything unpleasant that happens to you, you're going to make it about that other person and their bias against weight? I don't think that's fair to yourself, nor do I think it's fair to another person. Just like I don't think that if your political beliefs are such and such and the other person's are the other such and such, that we cannot respect and appreciate that theirs are different because they come from a different place. I don't agree with them, but I'm not going to think they're a bad or horrible human being. Just like, weight has not been my number one struggle in life. But that doesn't mean that I have ill feelings about people because of their weight. Just like a lot of people don't understand addiction and have a lot of judgment about that. And I'm hoping that, they can be open-minded enough to look at another perspective. So let's do a scenario here. We're going to have a pretend person named Melody. She's going to be our person who struggled with weight for years and years and years. And her experiences, like every one of us, have been shaped by what's happened in her life. It's been shaped by her emotions and the thoughts that have come from that. So Melody had a difficult childhood. She was picked last in recess. The other kids were cruel to her about her weight. And so, she felt sad. She felt hurt. She felt invisible. She felt dismissed for good reason as a child, right? Who could think otherwise? However, as an adult, she's holding on to this. People are going to dismiss me. They're going to automatically assume these things about me, which is an automatic assumption by her, right? She's got these beliefs about the world. It's unfair, it's unkind, it's cruel, and it's all because of my weight. So let's say Melody's at work, and she's walking down the hall with a close friend, Amanda. And Melody and Amanda are good friends, and they trust each other, and they care about each other, and they've been there for each other, and they're able to give each other feedback. So they're walking down the hall, Melody and Amanda. And another coworker, Tara, is walking toward the two women. Tara doesn't turn her head in their direction of Melody or Amanda, and, they pass without any exchange. Now, Melody is ticked, and she says to Amanda, "Did you see her? Did you see her? She refused to even look in my direction. She totally snubbed me. She just can't even look at me because of my weight. She is such a bee." Amanda says, "That was not my perception." Perception being, that's not what I experienced in the moment. Melody did experience that. That was her perception based on what's happened to her in the past, her worldview, her perspective. Amanda says, "I don't think she was snubbing you or me, for that matter. What it looked like to me is that she was deep in thought, She didn't even realize there was anybody else around." So we have two different perspectives. Amanda didn't experience the pain and the hurt that Melody did. Would it make sense that Melody might be coming from that place? Yes. Is it going to help her in her journey as an adult to automatically make these assumptions about other people, which may or may not be true? It is not going to benefit her. So who's right in this situation? Whose perspective was accurate? Well, we don't know because we haven't interviewed Tara. Okay? But we can see how Melody would have the perception that she had based on her perspective. So what she interpreted with her senses, what she saw was somebody snubbing her because of her weight, because that's what she's used to. That's what she expects from people. So that perception came from her worldview, how she's been treated in the past. But we're going to imagine that Amanda didn't come from that. She just sees people as people, and she didn't experience those things, and that wasn't her perception. She just saw somebody walking down the hall lost in their own thoughts. So if Melody hadn't experienced cruelty from others, or being left out, or made fun of, or, what she perceived as judgments, which could have been because of her weight, if she hadn't had that past, what might her perception have been in this situation, right? Would she have assumed that Tara was snubbing her, or would she just have had a different perspective? Maybe she wouldn't have noticed Tara at all. Maybe she'd have seen the situation more like Amanda. So here's my question to you. Are your perceptions of people and what they're thinking about you, or what you believe their motives to be, might they be colored or shaped by your perspective, what you've lived through as a person who struggled with the disease of obesity? Of course they are. Of course they are. They can't not be. So it's not a, gee, shame on you. How could you look at the world that way? Of course you look at the world that way. But here's the deal. Is it fair to you to keep punishing yourself with the thought that everybody's thinking such a thing about you? Or is it fair to the other person to assume that just because they walked past you without acknowledging you means they're thinking of your weight? No, it is not. So, our perspectives shape our perceptions of things in the moment, which doesn't mean we're perceiving them accurately. And it doesn't matter if it's from a weight bias, in this case, your own weight bias, not the bias of the other person. We know that that does exist. But maybe you're coming from a place of weight bias, just like I may be coming from a place of addiction and recovery bias. We all come from somewhere. Political biases, right? But it doesn't make us right. It doesn't give us the right to assume that everybody in the world is treating us that way because that's what we've experienced before. So, if you've experienced a trauma, maybe it's not related to weight, or a series of traumas, or, your life and your perspective related to the safety of the world would absolutely be different from the perspective of someone who hadn't experienced that. Just like if you're a first child, your perspective of the world is from that of a first child, which is going to be different from the perspective of an only child or the youngest of 6 children, because of what we've experienced in our life. So my first question again is, do you have a weight bias in terms of how you are assuming people are approaching you with their thoughts? I mean, you go into a restaurant and you're thinking everybody here's watching what I'm eating. Is that fair to everybody else in the restaurant? No, it is not. And that's coming from your weight bias. So my next question is, as it relates to your experience with weight, how you were treated by other people, how you felt, how you feel, the beliefs you have formed, how have the decisions that you've made in your life been influenced by the ways you believe people are going to treat you based on how you think about yourself and what you've experienced in the world? So, for example, if you've been rejected and abandoned by friends and family, do you anticipate the same from friends and partners? Most likely you do. Most likely you do. So we're going to ascribe this trait to another person. Like my husband ascribed, I am criticizing him because that's what he experienced from his mother. I ascribed to my husband some things that were very unfair to him too, based on my observation of my father and my uncles and a lot of the male adults in my life. Not fair to my husband, nor true. So we have to come to terms with, where is my perspective coming from? How does my perception color my, okay, let me say that again, my perspective, my life view? How does that color my perception of that cup? Is it half empty or half full? Do I look for things to be half empty, or do I look for things to be half full? Do I look for people to treat me kindly? Do I assume they're going to treat me poorly? And do I assume they're going to treat me poorly because they're judging me by my weight? Or is that bias coming from myself? So if we're willing to say, you know what, it's true that I was picked on. It's true that people judged me because of my weight. It's true that people called me names. And it's true that some people may still do that and may have that bias toward me. It's also true that that doesn't apply to everybody. Am I willing to ask myself the question, might I have not gotten the job promotion because I wasn't the best trained candidate? Might this person, choose not to be friends with me because we don't have anything in common? Might it be the case that it's not necessarily about my weight or my gender or my ethnicity? I don't know, but what I do know is that we owe it to ourselves and other people to consider the fact that our perspective doesn't make us right. It's based on things that happened in our lives, but that doesn't give us the right to assume that everybody is coming at us from that angle. It doesn't give us the right to assume that everybody who has different religious or political beliefs other than ours are bad or wrong. It does not give us that right. What all humans, I believe, could benefit from is saying, you know what? That person came from a different set of circumstances, a different home life, a different culture, a different set of religious beliefs, a different economic level, a different level of education. Not better, not worse. But their perspective is based on what they've experienced in life, as is mine. Therefore, because they are a human being of equal value, and I am a human being of equal value to every other human being, I deserve to be respected, and so do they. Don't have to agree with it, but I can respect it. So that's a lot to think about, but I think if you make the decision that a lot of the things in our lives are based on our skewed perception, based on our perspective, and that if we say, what if I looked at it from somebody else's point of view? Might I be more compassionate? Might I be less judgmental? Might I approach this situation differently? Might I feel less like a victim? Gee, not everything is about my weight to other people. Gee, not every situation is because of my weight. And I don't have to use that as an excuse to feel sorry for myself or to feel like I'm victimized in the world. And again, I only point out weight because this is a podcast about weight issues, but the same is true for everything else. Gender, ethnicity, etc., etc., etc. So let us all consider taking into account other people's perspectives for our benefit and for theirs. And I think that if you are willing to do that as a post-op, you're going to have a better outlook on life in general. And you're going to care less about what people think about you and say, you know what, it doesn't even really matter because this is my life and they can think what they want. I don't know if I'm right or wrong about how they think or how they feel, but I don't have a right to judge it. And I have to do what is right for me going forward in my life. What is the next wise thing for me to do in my bariatric journey? And then follow through and do that next wise thing. It'll help you let go of bitterness, anger, feeling like a victim, and realize everybody comes from somewhere, and everybody includes you and the other person. So they don't get a judge, and we don't get a judge. All right. I'd love to hear your feedback about this. So if you listen on a podcast station, please feel free to email me, cstapletonphd@gmail.com or info@conniestapleton.com. If you're watching this on YouTube or on Facebook or anywhere else, then please leave a comment. Love to hear your perspective about this, and I'd give yourself some time to consider all that was said. So thank you sincerely. New haircut again. Thank you sincerely for choosing to spend your time working on your own personal growth, listening to this podcast, considering the information, and see how it fits in your life or not. Take what you like, leave the rest. And please join the BariAftercare private group because we all need a home group. Let that be your home group, a place where you can feel safe and valued and nurtured, and where you can ask for help when you need it and share help with others when they need it. BariAftercare.com. All right, my friends, again, many thanks, and I'll be with you next time. Bye-bye.